So, Lone Rider here. Some sad news today. Um, I just heard on the radio this morning that the second survivor of the Parkland shooting in Florida this past year uh, recently took their own life. This was the second suicide of a Parkland survivor in a little under a year, I guess. And it's like a tragedy on top of a tragedy for these poor people because, of course, they survived a school shooting, and then now this. But maybe it should also be a caution and a warning to the rest of us as to how we treat these incidents when they occur. For a long, long time, there's been a tendency for people to politicize violent crime, in an attempt to use it as a talking point for whatever policy change they want. And gun control advocates in particular have been, have shown no compunction about flagrantly exploiting shootings. But the thing that everybody will have noticed, whether you follow politics or not, is that the Parkland shooting this past year was actually one of the most heavily exploited ever politically. There really seemed to be a full court press to try and use this to advance the gun control agenda, and in particular, to indelibly link in people's minds the tragedy of the mass shooting at the Parkland High School and gun control. And even before news broke of these, the first suicide and then the second one, many people like myself were arguing, not only is this not how you get well thought out policy, rushing off to the legislature in an emotional fit after something tragic happens while you're out of your mind with grief, but it's probably not also healthy, especially for the survivors, right? These people just underwent. Somebody's right to kill them, right? Somebody did kill their friends. They just underwent an experience that is going to, shake their understanding of everything they think they know about life, and they're going to have to get their head squared away before they can get on with their life. And for some of them, it's a traumatic experience that may be very hard to get over. And rather than focus on that and focus on them personally and improving themselves so that they can get their lives back on track, they were made a political flashpoint of a very divisive issue. An issue that, let's face it, for a good many people in this country, represents nothing more than an attempt to use the cudgel of government to attack innocent people, abridge their constitutional rights, and take away their stuff. Of course, I'm speaking about gun control. And I don't know if this was just sort of a naivete on the part of the gun control advocates, that they're so in favor of gun control that they didn't realize that it would be controversial or divisive to use this as a means of impugning the humanity of half the country. But, something tells me otherwise. Something tells me they knew exactly what they were doing. Now, the problem for the kids who survived the shooting is that the vast bulk of them weren't political, right? The ones that became the figurehead of the gun control movement, it was like 2 or 3 or 4 people maybe. What about all the other people, the ones who basically got left behind, got forgotten about, that nobody talked about? Were they getting the help they needed? Were they being left alone to get their lives back on track? We'll never know, right? And I'm certainly not suggesting that these 2 young people took their own lives because gun control advocates exploited the shooting that they survived. But what I am suggesting is that had the gun control advocates or the media or all these people had as much effort been spent trying to help these kids as use them as a political talking point to attack the rights and freedoms of the innocent, maybe these 2 young people would still be alive, right? And that's the thing. Maybe going forward, it's been working up to this ever-increasing politicalization of everything. But maybe there are some things we shouldn't politicize, like murder, right? Maybe we shouldn't politicize the death of innocent children, um, and use that as an excuse for attacking the rights of our fellow citizens with divisive, political policy. Just a thought, right? And again, we may never know why these two young people took their lives. It may have been, as the family of the latest victim suggested, survivor's guilt. But where does that survivor's guilt go when you're told the way to deal with it, rather than getting your own head squared away and getting your own life on track, getting help if necessary? Instead, you're told to direct all your anger and frustration at a political cause, a cause which can only be realized by the sacrifice of the innocent. Even if you really believe you're doing something good and those people aren't innocent, at some point, beating on innocent fellow citizens who only wish you the best and hope you get your life straightened out isn't very emotionally satisfying. And at some point, it's going to ring hollow. And whether the students in question were involved in the politics or even sympathetic to them or not is almost not the point. The point is that politicizing this took the focus away from trying to help these people. It not only, risked attacking the rights and lives of the innocent via unjust government policy, that they were using the tragedy of these kids' experience to argue for, but all the time we spent talking about gun control, we're not talking about, how to help these poor kids. And then you have 2 suicides in less than a year. Is it any surprising, that you have a result like that when the response to the shooting wasn't to come together and try and, make these kids a focal point for sympathy, but rather to make them a divisive political flashpoint to attack the rights of fellow Americans. That the goal wasn't to tell these kids to get their heads screwed on straight and, get their lives in order so they can get on with their lives and deal with what they've experienced. The goal was to tell them to take all that anger and pain and direct it at other innocent people who did nothing to them. And then, of course, when that proves fruitless, what are you left with? Well, you've suggested to them a means of dealing with their grief that isn't going to work, aside from victimizing other innocent people in the process. And at the end of the day, like I said, it's a tragedy on top of a tragedy. But that's kind of the way these things go, right? There's always 3 tragedies in a crime that's exploited for gun control. There's the tragedy of the crime itself, the violence and the people who were hurt and killed. There's the tragedy of the fact that the survivors are then exploited politically and their suffering is basically, made into a political tool. And then there's the tragedy of the innocent people whose rights are curtailed or sought to be curtailed by the policy that they're exploiting those innocent people for. In this case, it just happens there's a 4th category. You have the shooting, you have the exploitation of the victims, you have the creation of new victims by attacking the innocent with your gun control policy. And then you have one of the surviving people who was exploited takes their own life, or in this case, a second person. A tragedy on top of a tragedy on top of a tragedy on top of a tragedy. And like I said, I'm not saying that the gun control people exploiting this tragedy is the reason that these 2 young people took their lives. But what I am saying is if everybody had spent as much effort trying to help these kids as use them, maybe those 2 young people would still be here with us. Just a thought, right? So, a very sad, tragic thing, but, one I hope we can learn from as a society. If there's one takeaway from this, it's that, there are some things you shouldn't exploit politically. There are some things that shouldn't be politicized. And murder is one of them, right? Maybe if we hadn't done that, these 2 young people might still be here. Lone Rider out.